Ever think about those fairies from childhood stories? You have the delicate ones with the gossamer wings. Well, get ready to rethink everything because today we are going to really dive deep into a world where fairies are anything but sweet and dainty.
Yeah, we're going all the way back to 16th and 17th century literature to discover how fairies, these powerful and often kind of unsettling beings, became like this canvas to explore complex ideas about gender.
And we are so lucky to have insights from a conversation with Dr. Ezra Hobry for this. They're like a leading expert on Renaissance literature and queer theory.
Dr. Humphrey's work is just so insightful because it shows us how ideas we usually think of as modern, like transness and gender fluidity, were actually present and debated and reflected in the literature from way back then.
So before we jump into Shakespeare and Spencer, let's take a second and just picture the fairies that were in the minds back then. Forget Tinkerbell. We're talking about creatures tied to life and death, the forces of nature, almost like forces of nature themselves.
And it is so fascinating how different these fairies were from what we see today. Like in medieval folklore, fairies were often seen as strange, even kind of frightening figures. Like they were associated with dangerous places and used to explain things that people just couldn't understand.
So like sudden illnesses, unexpected deaths, maybe even those occurrences that made people whisper about witchcraft.
Exactly. Death, childbirth, even female sexuality, all of those things were wrapped up in the mystery and power of fairies. But as Dr. Hubry points out, the shift towards a more whimsical and childlike portrayal of fairies, it really began with the rise of theater.
That makes sense if you think about how they actually put on a play.
Exactly. Playwrights could only use the actors they had. And often, child actors, especially boys playing female roles, were cast as fairies.
So the image of the fairy basically started to change because of the actors playing them on stage.
And it really did have a big impact on how fairies were seen. Like instead of scary figures, they became associated with, well, small, delicate, singing, almost innocent things.
Wow, that's a big change. But Dr. Hobry actually takes this idea even further by connecting it to how childhood itself was understood in that time.
It's a really cool connection. You see, childhood back then was like initially viewed as genderless. Boys, up until 7 years old, were raised in clothing environments that we would consider feminine today.
Wait, so boys wearing dresses being treated in ways we associate with raising girls.
Yeah, and this idea of childhood as this gender-neutral space actually played a role in how fairies, who were often shown as childlike, were thought of in terms of their gender.
So it's almost like the lines were blurred, both for childhood and the fairies that sort of embodied those childlike qualities.
That is a great way to put it, and it helps us understand like a complex character like Ariel from Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Ariel, maybe one of the most famous fairies in literature.
And a perfect example of this childlike fluidity we've been talking about. Throughout the play, Ariel shifts between genders, embodying this kind of ambiguity that defies easy categorization.
Which is really interesting. Even though Ariel's referred to as he in the play, Dr. Herbury reminds us that back then, male pronouns were often used for beings without a gender.
Yeah, it's a fascinating linguistic detail that like challenges how we think about pronouns and gender today. Think about it. We use it for animals, even though they obviously have a biological sex. So in that period, using he didn't necessarily mean a fixed male identity.
So looking at it that way makes Ariel's gender even more ambiguous and open to interpretation.
Exactly. It reminds us that we can't just impose our modern understanding of gender on the past. We have to be careful not to erase those complexities.
Now, I'm curious about the dynamic between Prospero and Ariel. Prospero, the exiled duke, has this almost paternal authority over Ariel, always giving orders and demanding obedience.
And that relationship, as Dr. Hobry points out, can be seen as like a reflection of the broader societal expectations around gender, especially for boys.
So are you saying that Prospero's attempts to control and civilize Ariel sort of mirror how masculinity was imposed on boys around age 7? Like pushing them away from that earlier, more fluid understanding of gender?
You got it. It's like Prosper's trying to impose this rigid structure on Ariel, forcing them into a less ambiguous role, which in a way is exactly what society was doing to young boys as they transitioned out of that genderless space of childhood.
So Ariel represents this potential for fluidity, but the play also shows the pressures that push people to conform, especially as they get older.
Exactly. And this tension between fluidity and conformity, it becomes even more apparent when we look at how older figures were depicted in relation to gender.
It wasn't always fairies and young characters who challenged gender norms, right?
No. And this is where things get really interesting. Dr. Hubry highlights how well, perceptions of gender instability in old age were often viewed negatively.
It almost feels like there's a connection. The way society valued youth and associated it with beauty and vitality, while old age was seen as, like, a decline.
And this is where societal anxieties around gender come into play. Like, think about the witches in Macbeth. They're powerful, but also portrayed as grotesque and unsettling. Their gender is almost monstrous.
Especially that line from Banquo. You should be women, but your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so.
It's like their appearance challenges the categories of male and female, and that's shown as disturbing.
Yeah. It speaks to this deep-seated fear of the aging body and the perceived collapse of clear-cut sex differences.
And that fear, as we've seen, wasn't limited to fictional characters. It had real consequences for people who defied gender norms in their own lives. Dr. Hubry brings up Antonia de Arasso, who lived as a man for most of his life and even became a soldier.
It's a remarkable story, but also a reminder of the difficult choices people faced back then. Eraso had to navigate a world where defying gender norms could lead to, social ostracism, even violence, and it wasn't just men who faced those challenges. Dr. Hubry also mentions Eleanor Reichner, a woman who was arrested possibly for being in same-sex relationships, a stark reminder of the realities for people who challenge the rigid gender and sexual norms of their time.
These stories, both fictional and historical, paint a really complex picture of a society grappling with ideas of gender in ways that were both fascinating and sometimes deeply troubling.
We've gone from those fearsome fairies to Ariel, and even explored the anxieties around gender and aging. It's a lot to unpack, and it makes me wonder, how do we as modern readers approach these texts without, imposing our own perspectives and values? How do we bridge that gap between then and now?
That's the big question, and Dr. Hubry addresses it head on. They advocate for recognizing both the similarities and the differences between our time and the early modern period. It's about finding those moments of effective contact, those points of connection that help us understand people in the past, even if their worldviews were very different from our own.
So it's not about judging the past by today's standards, but rather trying to connect with those who came before us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that while their understanding of gender might have been different, their struggles with identity, belonging, finding their place in the world, those are experiences that connect us all.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. They let us explore the past, but also challenge us to reflect on our own present and the ways we continue to grapple with gender, identity, and what it means to be human.
And that exploration continues as we go further into the world of fairies and gender in 16th and 17th century literature. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive. We'll uncover even more surprising connections and insights. So welcome back to our exploration of fairies and how they connect to changing ideas about gender in 16th and 17th century literature.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. We started with these almost mythical, kind of scary fairies from folklore and saw how they transformed into, well, more delicate, childlike beings, often on the early modern stage.
And as we get deeper into this world with Dr. Hubry's insights, we're finding that these changes in how fairies are shown reflect this much bigger discussion about how society felt about gender and all its complexities during that period.
We talked last time about how defying gender norms, it wasn't just limited to fictional characters like fairies. It had real consequences for people who, dared to step outside of what was considered okay.
Totally. While literature gave us space to think about gender fluidity, the real lives of people who challenged norms could be very different. Dr. Hubry highlights a few people from history that really make this point.
Like Antonia de Arasso, for example, assigned female at birth, but chose to live as a man for most of his life, even became a soldier in the New World. It sounds like something out of an adventure novel.
It's quite a story, yeah. But we have to remember that Erasso's life was also marked by violence, especially against indigenous people. It reminds us that even while defying gender norms, individuals were still, products of their time and participated in the social injustices of that era.
It's important to see that complexity, right?
Right.
We can't just romanticize the past and ignore the darker parts of history.
You got it. And Erasso's story also highlights the difficult choices people had when dealing with gender identity. Like there were times when, just for safety, he had to reveal his biological sex. It shows this constant back and forth between personal identity and what society expects, something many people dealt with.
And then we have Eleanor Reichner, a woman arrested, probably for being in same-sex relationships. It really shows the harsh realities people faced when they dared to, go against the norms.
These stories are stark reminders that while we see some acceptance or exploration of gender fluidity in literature, the actual experiences of people could be very different, often filled with danger and persecution.
It reminds us that progress isn't always a straight line. There were definitely moments of openness in the early modern period, but there were also some really deep-seated prejudices and anxieties around gender. And Dr. Hubry mentions another interesting person, Mary Frith, who, well, didn't necessarily live as a man, but embraced a lifestyle that really challenged what was expected.
Mary Frith, yeah, also known as Moll Cutpurse, was a performer and a thief, and she just openly defied gender roles, like in how she dressed, how she acted, even her job. It's fascinating because she didn't change her name or pretend to be a man, but just by existing, she challenged what was considered okay for women.
It's a reminder that there were different ways to, like, subvert norms, even within those tight restrictions.
Absolutely. And Dr. Hubry also points to more recent research about individuals in 1650s Mexico who were executed for sodomy. These people lived as women within a female community, even though they were assigned male at birth.
It's another powerful example of how historical research can show us the many ways gender has been expressed throughout history.
Exactly. These stories, from both fiction and history, remind us that the past has many voices waiting to be heard, many experiences we need to understand. They challenge our assumptions and make our understanding of gender richer today.
Like we're putting together this complex tapestry, seeing that gender expression isn't just as simple either, but a whole spectrum of experiences that have always been there.
It is a delicate balance. Dr. Hubry emphasizes that it's important to see both the similarities and differences between then and now. We can't just read these texts with modern eyes and expect to get all the nuances of their world.
So it's about finding those points of connection, those moments where we can connect with the humanity of the people who came before us, even when their beliefs and actions might seem strange or even offensive to us today.
That's it. It's about that collapsing time through effective contact idea we talked about before. It's about those moments where the past speaks to the present, where we see ourselves in their struggles, their wants, their attempts to live in a world that wasn't always welcoming or understanding.
And we have to remember that there isn't always one right way to interpret these texts. Just like we want lots of different perspectives on gender today, we should approach these works with an open mind, letting different readings and meanings come out.
Absolutely. That's one of the best things about studying literature from this period. It's not about finding the one answer, but having a conversation, a dialogue across centuries. It's about seeing how these texts can both reflect their time and be a force for change, showing and shaping societal attitudes in complex and often contradictory ways.
Our deep dive so far has been mainly about fairies and gender, but I'm curious how these texts dealt with same-sex relationships. Was that something they talked about directly?
It was, and often in ways tied to these ideas of gender transformation. Dr. Hobry brings up Amintus again, where Jorkas is offered the chance to be queen of fairyland by marrying Oberon, the fairy king.
But Jocas resists at first, right?
Yeah, because he isn't a woman. Oberon's solution is to change Jocast into a woman, which was a common thing in these plays. It's played for laughs, but it does suggest some level of acceptance of same-sex relationships, but only after one person changes gender.
It's like the play is dealing with societal taboos by showing this fantastical solution, a way to get around the restrictions against same-sex relationships.
Right. And then there's Galatea, which maybe shows a more progressive view of same-sex love. Remember, it's about two women disguised as men who fall in love. When they find out who each other really are, Venus offers to turn one of them into a man to make their relationship work.
It's amazing how these plays, written so long ago, deal with themes that are still relevant and debated today. It shows the lasting power of stories and their ability to reflect and challenge norms.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that these plays don't just passively show those norms, they actively help shape them. They give us these glimpses into a world grappling with gender and sexuality in ways that might surprise, challenge, and even inspire us.
So are these plays ultimately saying yes to or pushing back against the strict gender and sexual norms of their time? It feels like they're in this in-between space.
That's a question that's up for interpretation, and that's Dr. Hubry's point. They say we shouldn't try to put these texts into neat categories like progressive or regressive. Instead, we should have a more nuanced understanding that sees all the complexities and contradictions in these works.
It's about appreciating the gray areas, where meanings change and overlap. These plays weren't written with how we understand gender and sexuality today, but they still give us these interesting glimpses into a world where those ideas were being explored and questioned.
Yeah, it's this variety of readings, this refusal to force one single meaning that makes these texts so valuable. They invite us to engage with the past on its own terms, learn from its complexity, and see ourselves in its struggles and wins.
This has been an incredible journey, and we're not done yet. We've gone from scary fairies to the shifting Ariel, and we've explored anxieties around gender and aging, all while finding surprising moments of acceptance and fluidity. But there's more to discover. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll continue to untangle the connections between fairies, gender, and changing perspectives. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this fascinating world of fairies and how they were portrayed in 16th and 17th century literature, especially when it comes to ideas about gender.
It's been a wild ride, right? From those kind of scary fairies in folklore to those more delicate ones we see on the early modern stage.
And all along the way, we've had Dr. Hubry's insights to help us understand how those changes in how fairies are shown really reflect a bigger discussion about gender, identity, and all those societal anxieties of the time.
Dr. Hubry really stresses that we shouldn't just try to slap our modern categories and labels onto the past. The way they understood gender was different, more fluid in some ways, but also limited by strict social rules.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
We got to remember that their language, their concepts, their whole worldview was shaped by different ideas.
You got it. And one of the key things to remember is that we can't just read these texts through our modern lens and expect to totally get how gender was experienced and expressed back then.
So if we can't just use our modern understanding of gender, how do we make sense of these texts and what they say about these themes? It feels kind of tricky.
It is. Dr. Hubry wants us to look for those moments, those points of connection where we can really connect with the lived experiences of people who are navigating gender in a totally different time.
It's about recognizing those shared human experiences, those struggles with identity and belonging that, go beyond time.
Exactly. For example, we see how anxieties about aging and the body were used to target both men and women who didn't fit in. That fear of people who blur the lines, who challenge the categories, that's something we still see today.
It's almost like those anxieties give us a way to understand how gender was controlled and enforced, both then and now.
And it's also really important to remember that there isn't one right way to interpret these texts. Just like we want a variety of perspectives on gender today, we should approach these works with an open mind, letting different readings and meanings come through.
It's like one of those optical illusions where you can see different images depending on how you look at it.
What a great way to put it. Every reader brings their own experiences to these texts, and that's what makes studying literature so cool. But Dr. Hubry also warns us against just using these texts to prove our own modern viewpoints.
Right. It's not about cherry-picking things to fit our current narrative. We got to be honest about the complicated parts, the contradictions in these works. They were products of their time, and they show both the good and the bad of that society.
And that's exactly what makes things really interesting. Those tensions, those ambiguities, they can tell us a lot. Take Amintos, for example. The idea of magical gender transformation is used for laughs, but it also opens up the space to imagine different ways of being, to challenge those fixed ideas about being male or female.
And Galatea takes that exploration even further, using magical transformation to resolve a same-sex love story. It's whimsical, but it also suggests a more fluid approach to gender and relationships than we might expect back then.
These glimpses into the past, these creative explorations of gender and identity, they challenge us to look at our own assumptions about what's natural, what's inevitable, what's even possible.
It's almost like those writers from way back then are holding up a mirror to us, showing us how our understanding of gender is always changing and how those same questions about identity, acceptance, and the freedom to be ourselves keep coming up.
That's exactly what makes this whole exploration so compelling. By looking at these old texts, we're not just learning about history, we're having a conversation about the present and future of gender.
So as we come to the end of this journey into the world of fairies, gender, and literary transformations, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
I think it's this. Don't be afraid to question what you think you know. The past is full of surprises, and the way people understood and experienced gender was way more complex and interesting than we often think.
And who knows, maybe these stories that are centuries old, these imaginative looks at fairies and gender, can inspire us to think about identity in new ways today. Maybe they can help us create a future where all those rigid categories we talked about become a bit more open, a bit more welcoming to all the different ways people express themselves.
Couldn't have said it better. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into fairies, gender, and changing perspectives. We hope you'll join us again soon for more exciting explorations of history, culture, and the power of stories.